glad to see you again on a topic which is very important. It's also in the headlines at the moment. It's about Afghanistan. Now, Afghanistan has been in our news for the last 20 years, especially when the first sort of attack took place by Bush for the attack on the World Trade Center. So what we have is Afghanistan for the last 20 years fighting a war which is classed as a war on terror by USA. Not only USA, but you had USA and ISAF, which is the countries which are in Europe, who became part of that group to go into Afghanistan to try and find Osama bin Laden. And also then what happened was that they did manage to catch him finally, but in the process their vision as well changed as to what to do with Afghanistan. And what happened there was that creeping development took place. They wanted to change the society, give women rights and so on, very noble sort of aspirations. But of course, not realizing that Afghanistan belonged to Pashtuns and their other ethnic groups that have been living there for centuries and had traditions which are quite different to what we consider to be a modern world. So that's when the battle ensued. After having sort of destroyed the infrastructure in the early days of 9/11, USA said, well, the battle has been won. In fact, Bush said, we have prevailed. But of course, they didn't. And what took place was subsequently for the next 10, 20 years, a battle that took away, in terms of blood and treasure, huge amounts. In terms of treasure, it was, I think, $1 trillion have been spent by USA, which is a phenomenal sum. And of course, number of lives runs into thousands, and of course, in Afghan and US soldiers and the public have paid for it in very high cost. So you can see a type of war that couldn't be won was initiated quite simply by going in there and destroying the infrastructure. And of course, the infrastructure they talked about is rather strange, because as one professor in USA said, that the infrastructure, what they had in those days where they were fighting the Taliban and so on, was not the huge telecom networks of what we have in the West, but they had pigeons. A pigeon communicating the messages that were required. So if you knocked out a few wireless poles and antennas, that didn't mean that the communication stopped. So what we have is really, again, a disparity in understanding the local culture. Let's see, what can we talk about today? We're going to be talking about the agenda for today. Of course, it's going to cover the recent talks of the pullout by USA. You know, Trump had said he would pull out the troops by the 1st of May, but when Biden came, he said, no, we're going to sort of not do it on the 1st of May, but on the 9/11 September, which is the anniversary of the 9/11, 20 years later. So Biden said we are going to pull out, which is good, despite the fact that there was an attack in Kabul in front of a school, killing a lot of people. And that hasn't deterred, because the condition of these talks was that Taliban would essentially not support violence and would be conducive to talk to the current government and so on. So they have abided by that. That's what they say. So they didn't do any violence, but yet there are other people, other sort of stakeholders in Afghanistan who feel that, you know, USA pulling out is not in their interest, so they want to keep them there, and that's why the attack took place. Similar to the type of situation that happens usually in Kashmir as well. People who don't want to have an agreement between India and Pakistan, they keep on sort of, you know, blowing things up in Kashmir and playing it on one side or the other, and therefore prevent talks taking place. So one has got to be a bit careful about this, and Unfortunately, Biden says, no, that's not going to deter us. We are going to pull out in September. And of course, we'll also talk about Taliban and who are they, where do they come from, what their religion and politics is. Then a brief history of Afghanistan as to where Afghanistan started in the early period of the colonial rule, as it were, and subsequent sort of problems and of development. And then we're also going to look at the legacy of this 20-year war, which has to do with drugs and battle-hardy Taliban, power sharing, again, Taliban with the Afghan government, and the geopolitics with all the people, surrounding powers who also want to be able to influence Afghanistan one way or another towards their particular agenda. Now, the pullout includes ISF, the International Security Force, I think it's called. It started last year, and they started having talks about it, but then it got kept on delaying it. But nevertheless, progress went on to sort of finally arrive in April here, which said, fine, we're going to withdraw finally, and it's going to be in September. Now, these are where all the forces are stationed. You can see all these countries that are at, that have a presence there: Australia, Canada, Denmark, France, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, Poland, Romania, Spain, Turkey, UK, and US. Interestingly, Pakistan is not there, which is, very significant. And I'm glad they're not there because, they are the neighboring country and they need to be able to have a more or less a neutral position to try and bring about a peace. And I think Imran Khan being in power, I think that is happening. So what is the deal between USA and Taliban? That Taliban the troops withdraw from the soil of Afghanistan because that has been the border contention with Taliban. So there's no foreign forces to be stationed in Afghanistan at all. And in return, there's not going to be any violence and there's going to be some power sharing to be had. Yet we don't have as to what that power sharing agreement is going to sort of entail. That remains to be seen. What are their goals? Their goals are going to be to form an Islamic government, which will have law and order, of course, but according to the Sharia law. Now, as I said before as well, Sharia is not a law as such, but Sharia is the principles that are from the Quran and the Hadith. And from these principles, you then codify law of your country and call it that Sharia law of that country. So that Afghanistan has to still do because that is sort of has to be done at a consensus of everybody there. Now, according to law, there's a Hanafi school of Islamic jurisprudence. There are about 4 schools which are very dominant in Islam. About 30–40% of all the Muslim world subscribes to the Hanafi school, which is a sort of a more liberal school of law. And of course, the traditions of Afghanistan very much play into how liberal an interpretation you can have of that law. And I'll tell you about it later about my meetings that I had recently with Afghan sort of people and a minister and another lady who was very well versed in women's affairs and of course Afghanistan and its history. I'll come to that in due course. What we are talking about is who rules Afghanistan now. It's the president of Ghani. He was actually put in by the West in a way, and therefore did not have really full local support, least of all from Taliban. So now that Taliban is coming into power, they did regard Ghani as a legitimate sort of representative of the Afghan people. So we have essentially the aim of the United States has been to stabilize the country and democratize it, which I'm sure can go some way, but it all depends on how that process gets underway. This is showing you basically that Taliban still control about 70% of Afghanistan. So they have a lot of power, clout, as it were. That's why they're talking to USA, because they are the only power that seems to be able to control events in Kabul. No, not entirely 100%, but at least to a very large extent. Now, who are these Taliban? They belong to a tribe called Pashtuns, Pashtun ethnic group. Now, Pashtuns are a very large group. They are also in Western Pakistan and in Afghanistan. And they are the ones who were very much part of that great game, you remember, of the 19th century, when British and Russian empires were sort of trying to battle out for supremacy in that region. The main desire of this Russian empire was to try and find an access through Afghanistan to the warm waters of the Arabian Sea. And Britain wanted to block that. And they were successful in doing that. And there were many, many wars that were fought. Now, another thing about the Pashtuns are all Sunnis. Now, Sunnis of the Hanafi school. Sunnis are, you remember, you take the Muslims as a whole, there's Sunnis and Shias. Sunnis are about 85% of all the Muslims and Shias about 15%. But because they're concentrated in Iran, they have a lot more sort of say in all their affairs, whereas Sunnis are spread all over the rest of the world, and therefore they have less influence. And since the Khalifa went, the Khalifa was the religious leader, and it was related some ways in the old days. But after the First World War, this position was taken away, which I think is detriment to the West as well, although British was very much part of making that happen with Kemal Ataturk to try and remove the Caliphate of the day. Despite the fact that a lot of Muslims said, no, keep the Khalifa, because he's like the Pope. We will be able to have some unity. And because the Khalifa has gone, there is fragmentation in the whole Muslim world, and therefore you see the state of affairs that are there, complete fragmentation, therefore not in the interest of the West at all. So it was a very bad move on the part when they moved the Khalifa. Now, the Pashtuns were the ones who were active against the Soviet war as well. When Soviet Union came into Afghanistan, a lot of refugees left and took for Pakistan. And there were camps of refugees, and that's where the Taliban actually come from. Taliban means students. I'll talk about that. How many are there? Well, there are 28 million of them in Pakistan and 12 million in Afghanistan. So you see the numbers are very, very significant in both countries. This shows you basically the spread as to how many Taliban control is. There's about 80% of all of Afghanistan, and the other two is by the warlords here. Now, as I said, the Taliban came out of those refugee camps of in Pakistan. The Taliban means students. And finally, once the Russians left, with the help of US fighting on their behalf to push the Russians out, they were governed from 96 to 2001. Mullah Omar was in charge. And of course, this is not only the Taliban, but all these Uzbeks and all the other people from the Central Asia that have been fighting as mujahideen against the Russians. So these Russian Afghan refugees who studied in these religious schools, these schools were built by religious sort of groups in Pakistan. Now, Jamaat-e-Islami, Ulema-Islami is a very powerful group in Pakistan, and they built schools for refugees there, supported by Saudi Arabia, and they brought in a type of very strict Islam, which is called Deobandis and also Wahhabi. It's sort of very close to each other. Yeah, here are the Deobandis. Deobandis are a sect that developed during the British colonial days in India. This was an anti-colonialist movement. They went they were traditionalists and not very convinced by the rationalists. You know, in Islam, you have both traditionalist and rationalist philosophers. The traditionalists are like people like Ghazali, very good scholars in their own right. And then you've got Ibn Rushd, who's a rationalist, also a big philosopher and scholar in his own right. We'll talk about these people at some future date. And what do they believe in? They believe in what they call the creed. The faith is to affirm your faith in Allah, which says one God, in his angels and his book, which is the Quran, his messenger, which is Muhammad, and the last day, which is the judgment day. And also believe that your destiny is already predefined in many ways. So they don't believe in its predestination, as it were, and less of a free will that we understand in our terms. And of course, they follow this school of law, which is the Hanafi. And the Taliban come from this rank of the Deobandis. So what is the Hanafi school of law? It's very widespread. About 1/3 of the world's Muslims follow that law. It was also during the Abbasid Caliphate and the Ottomans. Now, both of these empires, as you remember from my earlier talks, they are fairly liberal in their approach to governance, and therefore they follow that school. And it's a school that uses logic to formulate laws, taking the principles from the Quran and the Hadith. The Hadith is like the New Testament, life of Christ and his sayings. So the Hadith is the life of the Prophet and his sayings. And the Quran is the revelation that Prophet had, and that has the principles. And then you've got the Hadith also enacting some principles there. And both these form the source for this school of law. And this school then is formulating laws using these types of basic components, logic, analysis, with this case law, as it were. And therefore, it's a bit like a common law in some ways. But they overlay it with the traditions of each culture. So if Afghanistan is going to have a particular type of Sharia law interpreted in their own ways, they will arrive at which is acceptable to them, which will be quite different from the Saudi version. Saudi version is very strict, as opposed to very different to the one that is in Malaysia, for instance. So all these types of codifications of law reflects the state of the culture and the people in that country. Also, one of the things is that they're also liberal in their women's rights in contracting marriages, and they also came up with business laws for, and of contract rules and so on for businesses. Now, Afghanistan, brief history, you can say, is for hundreds of years, heroic sort of people, and they've been fighting, was only in the last 40 is the one that's most recent to us since colonial days, I suppose, pre-past colonial days. But before that, they have also been fighting all sorts of wars. What was it called before? It was still part of Iran at that time, Afghanistan, in the 18th century. And of course, this is the makeup of that by regions. Now, this is the spread of that empire during the 14th and 16th centuries. There's Pakistan, half of it. There's Afghanistan, there's Iran. There's the current sort of stans that are there. A part of Iraq and Syria, Turkey there. So this belonged to the Timurid dynasty. This is the dynasty which ruled very, very successfully for a number of years. Here we can see from 14th century to 16th century. And they had under their influence all that thing that I showed you on the map, Central Asia, Iran, Afghanistan, as well as large parts of Pakistan, India, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and Caucasus. It was founded by somebody called Tamur the Lane. You remember, this is a name as I remember from my history lesson of the 14th century India that I was reading, his invasion of India at that time. Now, the Islamic character of Afghanistan came about already as during the Prophet's time or soon after, because at that time there were two big empires, the Sassanid and the Byzantine empires, and the emerging sort of Muslim nations conquered both of them, especially the Sassanid, and therefore Afghanistan became Islamic around that period. And it is also, just as a by sort of note, the Mughal Empire in India, from which British Raj emerged, it's one of these Timurid prince, Babur, which is from this Afghan region, who came into India and set up a very successful dynasty of Mughal rule, which even to this day, we can look back on the buildings that they have left behind, like the Taj Mahal, for instance, absolutely top in terms of aesthetic sort of senses and gardens. The last sort of empire of Afghanistan was what was called the Durrani Empire. That's the 18th and 19th century. One of the ladies that I spoke to you about earlier on this meeting comes from that family, and very well read, and I'll talk more about it later. Now, this is the inauguration of that Shah, the king of Afghanistan in the 18th century. Now, we know all about the Great Game. See, I mentioned it earlier on. The game was played between Russia and Imperial Britain. It was essentially, a war to try and contain Russia from coming into the warm waters of the Arabian Sea. And the person who started this terminology, the Great Game, is Kip. He wrote Kim as well, Rudyard Kipling. Very good adventurous type of stories. I read parts of that when I was growing up. This is depicting the British lion, the imperial lion, and the great bear, Russia. Basically, both at loggerheads to try and obtain control over Afghanistan. These are the battles that were fought. Intense rivalry between British and Russian empires in Central Asia and the early 19th century. So this was a hand-to-hand combat, not like today, which is really from distance. So it was the old style of war. And the aim, of course, of this war was to have a buffer zone so that Russia doesn't expand its influence further south. So the result was that these wars really, series of unsuccessful wars for the British to control Afghanistan, Bukhara, and Turkey. So there was not much control in that period. Although wars were fought, and many of them, and here is the list, this one, the 19th century, the first, the second, and the third, and 4 wars, as you can see, fought very unsuccessfully. And British troops really lost that, but it contained Russia up to the point where Russia came in at the invitation of one of the rulers of Afghanistan. Now the game continues, of course, between America, China, and Russia. They're still very much concerned about the geography of Afghanistan being able to give so much access to all of the countries in Central Asia, in addition to Russia. So there plays a very important role. So Afghanistan is important. That's why, in fact, USA stayed on because it is such a strategically important area for that region. Just goes to show all these countries around Afghanistan here, and of course Pakistan. Now, because they've become very influential, because China has put this through this BRI project that they have undertaken, a road from China, Western China, to Gwadar here. And that means you're going to link up all that region into the warm water. That's why Russia is very keen to also become part of that whole game. And I think they are going to sort of have a big influence in that area. And already Iran has gone to China. So one can see that region really coming under the orbit of China and Russia. Now, who are the Sunnis? Sunnis are the two types, right? Shias and Sunnis. These form the two blocks of Muslims, like Protestants and Catholics. Sunnah means the practices of the Prophet and sayings. Now, Behlevis and Deobandis are offshoots of these larger entities, and they have their own particular, ways of expressing their allegiance to Islam. Behlevis are people who follow this. It's a less puritanical sort of outlook of religion, and they look at the Sufi orders as part of something that they can accept. And Sufis are those who revere the saints as well. So saints are those people who are honored. Whereas if you look at the Deobandis, I think they are a bit more reticent on that front. Like the Saudis don't recognize saints because they said recognition of saints is like worship. And they said that's against our principles. That's why they're a bit strict on that front. So you can see the Deobandis are Orthodox, Puritan. Taliban come from that. So it's a big job for them to now move them away to something which is a bit more liberal. Now, once this agreement takes place, once pullout takes place in September, donors have pledged 12 billion for developing Afghanistan, and hopefully the conditions are going to be met, which means that they must uphold human rights. And of course, then the question comes up, time and again. And I put this to this meeting that took place on Afghanistan, where this minister, who's a lady of Afghanistan, she said they're talking about protecting the women's rights as well. So the question now, when they are going to be formulating the codification of Sharia in that country, they're going to have to come out with this idea as to whether it is human rights that they have to give priority to, or to the community rights. Because you cannot sacrifice the rights of the community in favor of one or two individuals. As can be seen, sometimes it happens in upholding one person's right, you in fact penalize the whole community, which is why that argument is debate is very necessary to be able to come up with something which is acceptable to the country. Now, who's funding this? Well, drugs is the main source of finance. Now, it's against, of course, law in Islam to have any to do with drugs. But I think the argument is that in war, the higher cause wins over, the higher cause being their own life and their protection of religion. And therefore, they're going to fight it to try and drive the foreigners away. And that means that they can use any means to do that. And using drugs to try and fund their offensive and war is legitimate. That's why they're into it. And it is, a huge amount of, 80% of the financing comes from that, the funding. And the funding comes there because there is a market abroad. And I put the question at this meeting, and I said, why is it possible for Afghanistan to make this into a legitimate business so that they can have factories to produce medical type of marijuana or opium byproducts, which are for health, for medicines and for useful sort of medication. And of course, the answer is that at the moment, there's not enough demand for it, and there's no money to be made in peddling the drugs which have underground. Now, the demand is there in the West. Now, if the West decriminalizes the drugs, like Portugal has done, then the demand will become lower because it will be above board, and underground gangs don't have to sort of charge these tremendous prices for drugs and also damage society. So that's a debate that's still very much there in the West, how to curtail the demand. I think at the meeting there was one of the higher ups of the Afghan government who talked about narcotics and said there were so many gangs in Afghanistan that it was hard to control them in any meaningful way. The only meaningful way to control them was to try and cut down the demand and therefore the prices. And that depends on the demand in the West, which is the big market for this product. Now, China also is very active there, but not in the sense of being able to bring in guns and tanks and so on, but into very good social projects. Now, this is showing basically the hectares that are doing for growing poppy in Afghanistan. This dark area, this Helmand, that shares about over 30,000 acres is being used for cultivation, and progressively more around here. This is basically saying that Afghanistan supplies over 90% of the world's illicit opium, which is the main ingredient for heroin. So really one needs to sort of stop this somehow. or curtail the demand. That's the choice that every country is facing. Now, this is showing basically how much production that they have undertaken. Now, in 2019, they produced something like, here we are, about 8,000 tons. And the cost has 50 per kilogram. So you're talking about $250 million worth of money funding the Taliban and other people who are in this business. Okay, I'm not going to go into that in too much detail. I'll just go into this about Chinese projects. Now, they have been active, but on a low profile basis. They've done the hydro engineering project in Parwan province and built a hospital in Kandahar. Also at the university, another hospital in Kabul, vocational centers and low-cost housing and solar stations and so on. And also treating these Afghan children with heart disease in the Uyghur region, Xinjiang. And they have helped on the orphanages, primary school and secondary schools and poor families. So they are approaching Afghanistan with a different model, as it were. And I think they'll be quite successful because not only Afghanistan has a history of being part of the old Silk Road, it now becomes part of the new Silk Road as well. So, okay, I'm going to be just talking about this particular meeting that I had, and then we'll go on to Q&A. This meeting was hosted by one of the people who was very important in producing reports for the diplomatic service and to ambassadors and so on, and to foreign ministries. And they get their input from a lot of people who are knowledgeable about that area. And I was invited simply because I know the person. I've been attending many meetings, and I ask questions anyway. And the person who spoke was one of the prince. He was from Afghanistan. He gave a general outline of how things are shaping up there. And two more important people that contributed to that discussion was a minister, Afghan lady, who, of course, along with her colleague, also another Afghan lady, very well educated, very well spoken. And of course, both were very anti-Taliban because they feel that their fight for women's rights over the last 20 years has got to be maintained. And any agreement that takes place between Taliban and USA has got to ensure that. Now, it remains to be seen when the actual agreement gets printed or made known as to what else has been agreed. Because the agreement of pullout is with USA, but the agreement on governance is going to be with the local Afghan government and how they decide to run that country and govern that country with what sort of priorities to be given to women's rights, to women's education, to the economy and to regional geopolitics and so on, remains to be seen. But you can see that they're coming in from a point of fair amount of power, the Taliban. And that's why they are the people who are talking to USA and not any other party. So I'll stop here and then I'll basically go for Q&A. Okay, thank you. Bye. Okay, let's do the.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, Laila.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you this: education of women, is that opposed because they say it's part of the Islamic law? What's the problem there?
I think as far as the cultural sort of attitude of countries is concerned, they have various views on this role of women. And in Afghanistan, they're still very much in the mindset that women's role is one where they have to sort of be at home mostly. But I understand they are beginning to accept the role of women in education and being part of the daily lives in many sectors of the economy. But it remains to be seen how they're going to do this because there are going to be extremists as well, blowing up things. Like one of the stakeholders which blew up the car in front of the school last few days is again those extremist groups and those who are not interested in bringing about peace to to Afghanistan. So Taliban, I think, will probably not necessarily go for very modern type of education, but I think, as I could understand from these two ladies who were talking in that group, they want to preserve that right that they have at the moment that has been won over the last 20 years. And this is part of the demand which they're going to be making when the final arrangement for power sharing takes place in Afghanistan. So we'll have to see how much of that they will be able to retain of what they have. But I think it won't go back to square one, I'm pretty sure, because other countries who have advanced the women's sort of freedoms and education have done much better in the Muslim world. So that's a very good indicator to them as well, that this is the way that they have to move forward and not regress to the earlier ways of doing things. Or even for that matter, very strict interpretations of not only Sharia but also of the traditions.
I ask about who is arming the Taliban? Where are they getting all their arms from?
Well, they're growing it from poppy and they get the heroin. The amount, if you calculated 8,000 tons with about, what was the cost, $50 per kilo. So you're talking about, $250,000 billion worth of money, which
So they're just
somebody's
buying off,
making. That's
so
right.
they're just buying arms off the market.
That's right. Absolutely.
Oh, right.
You see,
From anybody.
and also their way of fighting is a bit different because, they don't have this, $100,000 armor that American soldiers have with all the gadgets on them.
Mhm.
They just have their, shoes and their Sten gun, and that's it, AK-47. And they go about it, and they get $10 paid by the Taliban authorities to go fight, because they said, look, this is your homeland you're fighting for, and that's it. So it becomes that way. Yes, Nimi?
Two things, Shafiq. One is I'm not quite sure what the Taliban have given as far as the agreement is concerned. It seems to be slightly one-sided to me. They're saying to the US, you get out and blah, 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 all the rest of it. So although they've sort of said they won't be violent, etc., I'm not sure whether that is right and whether they'll do that. The other thing I want to ask you is this. Now, you said that there are 28 million Pakistani Taliban. Is that correct?
Not Taliban, 28 million Pashtuns.
Pashtuns, yeah, exactly, that's right. And as Pakistan becomes sort of more and more religious and fundamentalist or whatever it is, how much of a risk is it to Pakistan, the effect of the Taliban succeeding in Afghanistan and then obviously with the Pashtuns across the border? Is it a real risk?
Well, one of the things that Pakistan has shown is that its army, which is highly sort of efficient and well trained, they have overcome the war on terror that was there in Pakistan. And they have, in fact, managed to control that. There was these Taliban in Pakistan as well that were causing mischief. They have been overcome by the army. And at the moment, their presence in Pakistan is not as much. But the Pakistan sort of position is one of having these religious parties. They're not Taliban, but the religious parties who have a very strict code of interpretation of the religion. And that is the one that at the moment is what the current Pakistan government is facing, because they want to come out in protest, especially against the blasphemy laws that are there in Pakistan. Pakistan is, and also this Tariq that came out with protests just last week, is against against France, and France's treatment of the Muslims cartoon sort of depiction by the school teacher, and that statement by Macron has been taken very, very sort of seriously by Pakistan, and especially this religious party who says throughout the ambassador and do this, that, or the other. Pakistan government is saying, no, we shouldn't do that. What we can do, of course, is to try and bring about a change in the mindset of people who don't understand the value and the place of religion in Muslims' lives, in Pakistan especially, and that any desecration of what they believe in and defamation hurts them in the same way that the Jews get hurt about the Holocaust, for instance. So if it is a criminal thing in Germany or wherever to call this, to give Holocaust that particular status, the defamation of the Prophet Muhammad in such terms which is followed by, 2.5 billion people in the world, should be in fact also a criminal offense if that is so. So Pakistan is now saying, yes, we are going to try and influence the Muslim countries in having a common stand to bring about, a type of outlook which is against Islamophobia in the West by educating them.
So sorry, that's right. But I think the problem is also that, the Taliban, and I think that Tehreek, whoever they are, who are all for killing people, they think the fact that a teacher's head was chopped off because of that, whatever the cartoon was, is fine. And in fact, he deserved it. So this is a bigger issue almost than just saying you're insulting us by printing pictures of the Prophet or whatever. As I say, I have no idea what the pictures were. And as I understood it, he had sort of warned people that he was going to show them, etc. But the thing that concerns me is that when the teacher's head gets chopped off, all the Muslim countries don't actually say, well, that's perhaps an overreaction. They feel they have to support the Taliban and the other sort of hyper-religious Muslim groups.
Well, I think the head chopping, I don't think any Muslim also sort of condones. It is the action of some extremist groups which you find elsewhere. So there is that risk of the extremists reacting to such behavior. But I think what Macron has done in addition, which has caused a lot of concern, is that it has put forward a motion in European Parliament to make Pakistan revise its blasphemy laws. And if they don't, then the export of all their items, textile items to Europe will be taken away. So it is a blackmail that is being put in the way of with the pretext of saying, first it was the freedom of speech that you should have to say whatever you want. And secondly, now that if you don't abide by it and don't change all the laws according to our wishes, then you're going to suffer the economic war that we are going to be engaged in. And I think that is a wholly unacceptable position to take. And I think it won't work, I don't think, because it needs to be treated not on a confrontational basis, but on a discussion and being able to take an approach which is a commonsensical.
How's your feet?
Yeah, George. Yeah, go ahead.
I couldn't get in. The website on the U3A one was different to your one, but never mind.
You couldn't get into my site?
Yeah, I got on your one, but I couldn't get through from the UTA one.
Oh, I see.
Never mind. What I wanted to ask you, Shafiq, was you mentioned that they get the money from the heroin, the poppy.
Yeah.
Well, how does that square with Islam to sell intoxicating drugs to buy weapons? Because it doesn't seem very Islamic to me. It seems a little bit different. So
it doesn't. Yeah, George. To put it simply, it doesn't. In war, that's what they say. In love and war, everything is fair. So what is happening is that the war, once it starts, nobody's going to be abiding by the rules of the game. And therefore, everything that makes them feel that the higher cause that they're fighting against is the protection of their own country and their lives. And therefore, this little thing about drugs is really the problem of the West, not of us.
Right, so who's buying the heroin from them?
The West. All the gangs that are operating, which are from Central Asia, from all that region, they bring it into Europe through the Balkans and through Eastern Europe, and all that is coming there. So it is, and you know, all that Middle East area, which is in a turmoil. So this is where all that drug is coming from.
Right, but it's not very. It's very strange, you know, that like that they that they know that they will be producing untold misery in the West by exporting heroin.
Well, they blame the West for the current situation of having destroyed the whole society and their country. And they say everything is fine if we hit back at them, one way or another.
We'll talk tomorrow about it.
Shafiq, you didn't, I don't think you didn't finish the risk, whatever it is, to Pakistan with the Taliban and the Pashtuns and the increasing fundamental religious movements in Pakistan itself. Do you think there's a risk of it almost becoming a failed state? I know you said the army will deal with them, but it's only a matter of time before you have these Muslims in the army, isn't it?
One of the things that Imran Khan is doing to try and control this movement, which is a very popular movement in Pakistan, is to bring the matter to Parliament. And he says in Parliament, we are going to try and give this group of religious people, which are quite extensive, into an identity of a political party, which can then have the responsibility of being able to argue its case in Parliament, rather than going out in the streets and causing havoc. So that's the measure that is currently underway in Parliament in Pakistan.
Shafiq,
Yeah, Maureen, yeah.
I just ask, during the Russian time, what was the attitude of people in Afghanistan? It seems like, didn't they get invited in to help against the Mujahideen? That was the story I read.
Yeah, there were, you see, local politics were at play. The ruler had one view and the public had another view. So when the Russians came in, they undertook some very good projects. One of the tunnels they built in Afghanistan is still operational and, very useful. But then you see the big game started with USA's interest. And what USA did was to supply the Mujahideen with these rocket launchers that brought down the helicopters of Russia. And once they had this armament given to them, they were able to bring down all helicopters of Russia. That's why Russia had to retreat.
Yeah. It's an interesting film called Charlie's War. Have you seen it?
Exactly. That's it. The money that came in fact, the Osama bin Laden and all that were in fact staked by USA and CIA, to fight the Russians.
And then when the Russians left, we just abandoned them.
That's right. That's what happened. And when USA pulled out after the Russians left, then the Taliban came into power and in all their glory did whatever they did.
They had all the money and the guns and the whole blooming bit.
That's right. I know that one case when I was there doing a project in Pakistan, there was a big camp in Zia's time. Zia-ul Haq, he was the president. It was called Ujri camp. This was full of armaments from USA. But then, of course, what the US did was to try and blow up that whole camp because they didn't want the arms to fall in the hands of the Pakistanis or the Taliban or the Afghans.
Oh dear.
So I think half the city probably was rocked by that.
Oh God. But I think Britain gave them guns and stuff as well, Stinger missiles and all kinds of heavy duty.
Yeah, part of this this whole war, I think all those armaments have been flown into Afghanistan for the use of the ISAF and USA. But of course, these arms also fall in the hands of the Taliban. Yeah. But I would sort of look upon this as rather a good starting step, because at least there is some decision to pull out, because, you know, there was no, so long as the foreign troops remained there, whatever the arguments of, you know, freedoms and democracy and all that, it was not going to be a secure country.
No.
We'll just have to accept that there is going to be a certain way of having to, you know, leave a country to manage its affairs, but bringing in types of measures which will make them, in fact, you know, attracted to those policies. These gunboats and gun policy is not working.
No.
You know, it just means more guns come into the picture, and that game gets played for, you know, and it's a game that nobody really wins. We have seen, if you like, even in Vietnam, USA had to pull out in a bad way. Now USA has to pull out from Afghanistan after 20 years. And if you look at any other sort of countries as well, they have to pull out. You know, the local people, no matter how poor they are, they seem to put up a big battle. Look at Yemen, for instance. When Saudi Arabia went in thinking that they're going to quell that country in 2 weeks and come out with, you know, with all sort of kudos, they got stuck there for 6 years. Yeah, you know, okay, we may say that Iran is helping them, this, that, or the other, but at the end of the day, these people are, you know, putting their lives at stake and they're fighting. You know? This is quite astonishing how resilient these people are. It also goes to show that the people sitting in either the State Department or in Whitehall or in the Riyadh, wherever these decisions are made, they have no idea what the ground realities are, or if they have, it's not good information. I was told that in our own Foreign Office, you know, not now, but a few years ago when I heard this, there wasn't a single, I think it was the guy who wrote the book, I forget his name now, Stuart something. He walked right across Iraq and Afghanistan.
Rory Stewart.
Rory Stewart, that's him. He said that the Foreign Office didn't have a single person who could speak Afghan language, you know, in when they got posted. So when you have so little, if you like, understanding of any country, you're not going to make good decisions. And we see the result of these bad decisions, you know, right now. Well, the sort of good prospects is I find that at least I can rely on good leadership from Imran Khan, good leadership maybe from Biden as well. I'm not so confident about Boris, of course. Angela Merkel is going away, which I feel very sorry about and feel, you know, quite, you know, because she was the moral, you know, flag bearer of Europe, I thought. And of course, she's going away. We'll have to see what happens. But anyway, end of Ramadan in a couple of days, so we can celebrate. And fasting will be over. Can go back to normal life, and lockdown is over as well by then.
We can go back to normal life, but the Afghanis can't. They must be really worried. The population must be wondering what it's going to go on now.
Yeah, one big step, of course, that has been taken is, of course, the decisions is still there. You know, come September, they're going to leave. The next thing is to be able to see whether the Afghan government and Taliban start talking, because then power sharing is going to be the one way forward. And in that sort of dialogue, discussion, they're going to talk about the progress to date, about women's rights, I'm sure, about all sorts of other things. That remains to be seen now as to what's going to happen. So at my next meeting, which is going to be next Wednesday, I'll keep abreast of what the developments are, because this group that I belong to, it's quite sort of influential in preparing papers as to what the feeling is from various quarters, and they feed that to the diplomatic office. Mhm.
Thank you. Good.
Great.
We'll wait to hear.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Dimi, you did a very good job today. I saw that thing about scams.
It's
Yeah, you're going to send us those links because I'm very interested in getting that link from USA that tells you if any of your own sort of links have been hacked. You know,
They've actually sent us lots of other stuff, so I'll pass it to Gilly, and hopefully it'll be in the newsletter. There are lots of websites and lots of information.
yeah, a lot of scams going on. So all of you be aware.
Mm,
They're so convincing.
mm.
Yeah. Mm.
Great. Thank you, Shafiq.
Okay.
Thank you. That was
Call it a day, and
very
thank you
interesting.
for your contribution. Sorry, I didn't record my earlier talk.
Oh, well, you'll have to do it again.
I keep failing that. I don't know what happens, you know.
Maybe your
I have to
camera
repeat
shy.
that now. In the next 15, 20 minutes, I have to repeat that. Oh, dear.
That was
Okay.
really interesting, Shafiq. I found that very interesting.
Yeah, okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.